Jake, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. Okay, maybe there's not a translation that says it just like that, but let's talk about that. Hi, I'm Joel, and welcome to Armchair Theologian, as we discuss our series, Jesus According to Jake, a study of the Epistle of James. So here's the question. Who's Jake? In the original Greek, the word that we translate as James is Jacobus. That may tickle your ears and sound a lot like a Hebrew name that you may have heard at some point, which is Yaakov, which we translate as Jacob. So for familiarity's sake, I'm going to call this Jacob Jake, just so that we can be sure that I'm talking about him and not the Jacob you may know from the Old Testament. So the author of James is a man named Jacob, and the question becomes, where did we get the name James? Well, it's a matter of a translation of a translation of a translation. Our English name James comes from the Latin translation of Jacobus, which was Iacomus. So you have the Jacob that becomes Jacobus, which becomes Iacomus, which becomes James. Now the question is, who is this Jake that's writing the letter? We have to note that most scholars believe that this Jake was James, the brother of Jesus. You have to imagine the ride that James went on here. He grew up in the same household as Jesus. He didn't believe in Jesus' ministry until he was older, after he had a resurrection encounter with Jesus that changed his entire perspective. But after this resurrection encounter, he becomes a prominent member of the Jerusalem church, becoming the leader of the church in Jerusalem. We find him taking a key role in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. History tells us that James was a leader there, that he led the Jerusalem church until his death as a martyr in 62 AD. Now, hearing that James died in 62 AD may lead you to another question of, well, when was this letter written? And from what we can tell, this letter was likely written in 61 AD, just a year before his death. So what did the world look like in 61 AD? As Jake wrote in the warm, dry climate of Jerusalem in 61 AD, Christianity had spread across the Mediterranean region for the last 30 years. And this is the 30 years following the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Nero had been crowned emperor just a few years earlier in 54 AD. This was following the rule of Claudius. Just in case you're wondering, the famed fire in Rome did not occur until 64 AD, just a few years after James's death. As he writes, tension is mounting. There was a famine that hit Egypt in 45 AD. So again, thinking through this, 45 AD to 61 AD. You've got 16 years. Why does this famine come into play? Well, because one famine has a cascading effect for years to come. Grain production dropped, and not only was there famine in Egypt, but there was an insurrection in North Africa, which led to grain shortages across the Roman Empire. Rome itself had seen a few riots as a result because they relied so heavily on the bread for the masses. Nero had begun the debasement of the common currency, the denarius, by reducing both the size of the coin and the silver content in it. So this was leading to inflation on top of the normal inflation that would happen when you have low supply and high demand. Jerusalem didn't have any rioting, but tensions were there because Jewish zealots saw Jewish aristocrats as a key part of the problem. There had been a lot of shifting around of land ownership, and small farms had been put out of business. These families would become tenant farmers and would work for these wealthy families. The Zealots had disdain for the Jewish aristocracy because they saw them as complicit in the crimes of Rome. And these tensions would ultimately lead to the Jewish insurrection of 66 AD, which would culminate in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jake writes this letter with all of this as the backdrop. What do you do when the economy is tanking? What do you do when the political situation is tense and uncertain? What do you do when there seems to be a very real threat of violence for your nation? Now the question becomes, to whom did James write? And he starts out the letter with a statement of, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. After the Babylonian captivity, many Jews just settled down in the regions that they had been exiled to. So you have Jews who have been dispersed abroad throughout this Mediterranean region. So you had Jews in Judea, and then you had Jews also spread out throughout Rome, Asia Minor, Parthia, which is now kind of Armenia, and on down. These were Jewish believers who were looking for guidance from someone with authority, and Jake gives them their rallying call. Now, as a sidebar, if I say something to you like, use the force, Luke, or you shall not pass, you probably hear that as a callback to a movie or a book that is kind of in our cultural understanding, right? That's in the background of our culture. So whether it's Luke Skywalker in an X-Wing barreling towards the exhaust port of the Death Star, or Gandalf staring down a Balrog in the mines of Moria, these references bring images to our minds. James, or Jake, does the same thing here. Starting off the letter with his own name, he brings about this callback, this image that these Jewish believers would have pulled up in their mind. The overarching story of the Old Testament has, towards the beginning, this image, this scene of Jacob speaking to his sons, giving a farewell address. James, or Jake, or Jacob, if you prefer, here is capitalizing on his own name so that he can have that pastoral call in the same kind of way that Jacob did with his boys. Furthermore, there are other callbacks throughout this letter. This epistle serves as Jake's commentary on Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Throughout this letter, there is reference after reference after reference to the Sermon on the Mount. So our final question becomes, why study this letter? Jake writes during the tense era. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is something that you can identify with. That we find ourselves in the midst of an era of tension. This time where the economy's kind of up and down. We've seen the impact of that global pandemic come on in to our economies with this lasting ripple effect where you wonder about inflation, you wonder about your job security, and James is written to an audience that understands that. Maybe you look at the political tension in our era and you wonder, how do I remain faithful to Jesus in such a tense era? And James is written with that kind of audience in mind. You and I can gain so much wisdom from this letter, because to a degree, that's what this is. This is wisdom literature written to be preserved for the church throughout the ages. There are themes and topics that we'll examine from Jake. How do you suffer well? How to relate with the haves and the have-nots? And what is true wisdom? Truth be told, this is a timely letter for all of us. We need a letter like this to help remind us how to be faithful to Jesus in an era of compromise. So join me as we dive into what is an essential letter for our time. Be sure to like this video so that you can go back and find it. Subscribe to the channel so that you can stay up to date on this series, and to watch future videos that go along with this series. Until next time, thank you for joining me here on Armchair Theologian, and let's follow Jesus well.